project, an Australian Research Council linkage project, which I've been doing with Paul Senziuk and Carolyn Collins from the University of Adelaide. And as has been mentioned, that's my own intellectual home, the University of Adelaide. I'd like to start by saying that I know very little about Holden model numbers. I'm sure there are many people in this audience who know a lot more about specific Holden cars, but I'm here to talk really about how General Motors Holden and Holden itself evolved from being a small Adelaide company to being really one of the engines of wartime production during the Second World War. So in some ways we might have a bit of a helicopter view, particularly of the wartime economy. But I hope that you will tolerate it if I don't know a particular model number. Now, if you say the word Holden, of course that's what people think of. And it's probably the FJ, you know, the iconic car of the 1950s. But the company's history, as I'm sure you know already if you've been to the exhibition below, dates much further back in South Australian history to the mid-1850s, when James Holden began a successful leathery and saddlery business in Adelaide. During the Boer War, he joined with another company, Frost, in 1885. There had been an earlier merger, but probably the company was best known in the late 19th century by this name. This site is in Grenfell Street, but I note now, having seen the exhibition myself, that there's no horse. So one of the interesting questions is, when did the horse get onto this building? You'll see the horse's head downstairs. Now, during the Boer War, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the company secured large contracts from the government to make saddles. And then in 1909, Holden expanded the company's operations to include motor body trimming. Some of you will remember these kinds of cars, and you can see the sort of natural progression from making saddles to making the hoods for these cars and the seats. And gradually they started to create bodies, then largely of wood. By 1915, the Holden company had constructed its first complete car body and sidecars for Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Now, in World War I, a war that, of course, inflicted terrible suffering and chaos on Australian society, there were commercial opportunities, because in 1917, the Australian government, that was facing great shortages of foreign exchange and shipping, placed an embargo on the import of complete cars. There had been many cars imported, fully made. And then it extended that embargo to motor bodies. But the government did allow motor car chassis to be imported. I'm pleased that I don't actually have to tell this audience what a tariff is, but at this stage, the Australian government was absolutely committed to basically protection on everything. And so they did allow these chassis to be imported. And this opened the opportunity for a company like Holden to build the bodies, in fact, many different kinds of bodies, to sit on these imported chassis. Along the way, Holden joined forces with a Dodge distributor, Cheney, and built bodies for these imported chassis at very competitive prices. Now, in the 1920s, Australians took to the motor car like very few other people in the world. And this gave great opportunities to Holden, which in 1923 began to build the plant at Woodville. I hope you can see, it's the best photograph I can find. And interestingly, it signed an agreement at that time with an American company, General Motors Export Company, that was also bringing in chassis and wanted a stable supply of the bodies to put on a chassis. So Holden joined forces with this General Motors Holden Export Company and pretty well allocated the Woodville plant, which of course is only one of several plants, to the production of bodies for General Motors, the American company. Holden did have another branch at this time, or two, later at Birkenhead, but you'll see downstairs the King William Street building, where they also continue to make car bodies. But Woodville had a very close association with the American company. Now, in the mid-1920s, of course, things started to go a bit sour in terms of the Australian economy. And should I say, just in passing, it is not the stock market crash of 1929 that causes the Great Depression in Australia. The Australian economy was in recession, and particularly the South Australian economy, as early as 1927, for complex reasons that I can talk about later if you're interested. So the problem for the Holden company was that competitors, oh, here they are, 1927, they're making the old style car. Competitors start to enter the market. Firstly, Ford, which builds its plant in Geelong. But then General Motors decided to expand its operations and to start to make cars itself in Australia from the mid-20s on. Now, first of all, Holden had an agreement with General Motors Australia, as it was called, whereby it would continue, as I said, to devote a large amount of the production at Woodville to the production of bodies to go on General Motors chassis. But then it became apparent by the end of the 1920s that Ford was going its own way. It wasn't going to purchase bodies from Holden, nor was General Motors Australia. So in 1929, the Holden company, pretty well, they would admit, seeing the writing on the wall, sent Edward Holden, Ted Holden, who was chairman of the board after his father died, to the United States with the license to offer General Motors Corporation in the United States the license, an option for the purchase of the Australian company. So Holden didn't have much choice by this stage. I mean, this is startling figures of what happened to car production from 1927, or was it 28? I need my glasses. The curse of late age. As you can see, just the car market absolutely collapsed with the onset of the Great Depression. Generally, it's considered the absolute bottom, the nadir of the Great Depression in Australia was 1932. And you're probably aware that South Australia was probably one of the most seriously affected states in the Great Depression. Now, Holden really was facing bankruptcy, and so it agreed to this merger with the American company General Motors. And out of that came General Motors Holden. Now, the merger, as I said, for Holden had particular benefits because they were going broke. It was agreed that the Australian directors would continue to manage the board and the company. And one of the tensions for GMH, of course, in the 1930s, and indeed after the Second World War, was that it was open to critics that it was an American company actually producing the Australian car. So the new company had to keep stressing the importance of Australian management of the company, and therefore the majority of the board was meant to be Australian, and they were meant to be investing, of course, in production of Australian commodities of all kinds. What the merger did was guarantee the future of the Woodville plant, which at that stage was probably producing somewhere between 70 to 80% of the bodies already for General Motors. So Woodville gets its future guarantee. There's, of course, much greater efficiency with the merger. And I think fundamentally important, though we never really talk much about this, is that the merger gave Holden access to the technology of this extraordinarily global organisation. Just wait till you see the figures of what General Motors produced in World War II. For General Motors Australia, the merger gave them the a new base in Australia. And as I've said, it enabled them to present themselves to Australian governments and the Australian public as being Australian, not just American. And this was an age of great nationalism and, of course, as I've said, of a very tight tariff regime. They got the company for a good price at that time. But they also felt, I think, in Detroit, a sense of moral obligation to Holden because of the agreements in the 1920s that meant that so much of the production at Woodville had been devoted to producing car bodies for General Motors. So then we had the merger. There doesn't seem to be much opposition to the merger in Australia. I think people saw this as, the only way that the company could be saved. But, as you might expect, the marriage didn't have all go smooth at the beginning. So here we have Edward Holden, the Australian leader, and on the right a man whom I'll talk about a lot in a minute, Lawrence Hartnett. Now, I have in the records found that Holden's standing with the American partners, alas, was not high. There's a sort of memorandum from the mid-1930s that says, alas, that Ted Holden was being laughed at in the United States. Now, that may say as much about American hubris and sense of superiority as it would about Ted Holden, but still there were real tensions between Ted Holden and the Americans who'd remained managing the company, and progressively the Americans go back home because of that tension. And this man, Lawrence Hartnett, is appointed. Now, he's an extraordinary figure, very energetic, very prone to self-promotion, as you'll see in a moment. And he had a career that dated back to World War I, when he'd worked in the armaments firm Vickers in the United Kingdom. He's British. He trained as a pilot in World War I, and in the 1920s he'd been very active in the marketing and importing of cars, first in Singapore and then with General Motors in India, and then in the late 1920s he had become the director of Vauxhall, which was then a subsidiary of General Motors. And in many ways, if you read Hartnett's memoirs, the story of Holden becomes the story of Hartnett. He was not a man to be modest about his achievements. When I was writing an article on this subject, I was asked by the readers whether there was, any criticism of a British executive being appointed to head General Motors Holden. But those were the times, which I'm sure some people in this room remember, where to be Australian was also to be British. People didn't feel any conflict between those two identities. And so the press sort of said, well, yes, we'd rather an Australian was managing the company, but after all, he's British. So there was a sense in which he was part of that wider imperial family, and therefore his appointment was acceptable. Well, he did turn the company around dramatically and financially, but as I'll say in a moment, there were other things happening in Australia that helped him. But under Hartnett, the company expands from South Australia into Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, and most importantly, to Fisherman's Bend in Victoria, in Melbourne. And critically for the war production, right next to the Fisherman Bend factory was established in 1936 a company called the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, which becomes the leader in trying to produce aircraft for Australia during World War II. Now, Hartnett says, as I said, he wasn't a man to hide his light under a bushel or whatever you hide lights under. He said, every decision I made in the 1930s seemed to be the right one. But I would argue that, of course, General Motors Holden benefits from wider changes. I put up the top a classic sort of academic issue. I think when academics try to understand change, we're always trying to balance the role of individuals against the broader structural changes. You can't innovate in certain environments, but Hartnett came to General Motors Holden in Australia in 1934, when we're just beginning to pull out of the Depression. And there is a wider recovery of Australian manufacturing. People debate how important manufacturing might have been in the recovery, but generally it's thought that the manufacturing benefited from the tariffs, which had been increased. They could produce products that couldn't be imported any longer. The car industry took a bit longer to recover, but it does start to recover, and critically important in the 1930s is the expansion of the Australian metals industry, because this is the time that cars are moving from being wooden framed to being made of metals. And we have, of course, the expansion of Port Kembla and Newcastle and other places. And in 1935, GMH converts to an all-steel car rather than wooden frame. The tariff protection I've mentioned, but of course, what you get with a merger is the investment of not just US technology, but US dollars. General Motors in America was reformed in the 1920s, and it adopted a model which is now generally considered to have been the key to its own success, which was to allow its branches overseas to have considerable autonomy and control of their own marketing and budgeting and financial management and workforce management. And so this suited Hartnett's style of entrepreneurial management very well. But at the same time, you know, he's sending men from Australia over to the United States. Experts from the US are coming to South Australia and to Victoria in particular to see, you know, to ensure that the company is benefiting from the most recent technological developments. And you'll see there my figure that between 1930 and 37, the production of motor bodies increases almost exponentially. And as I've mentioned, they open Fisherman's Bend. Now, as you'll see when you go downstairs, a lot of stuff which is put together, say at Woodville or other plants, is also being, the components are being produced at Fisherman's Bend. So the engines are being made at Fisherman's Bend, and Woodville might be putting them together into the car. So then we get also here we have him on your right, Lawrence Hartnett, with the then Prime Minister Joe Lyons. As I've mentioned, for the company they had to be very careful to always position themselves as Australian, and Hartnett was a superb at public relations. He knew how to cultivate politicians, so every time something important happened, like the opening of Fisherman's Bend, he would make sure Joe Lyons was there and the press, and he very carefully cultivated in the late 1930s links with the Department of Defence. He could see war coming, and he kept telling Joe Lyons, who of course died in 1939, and anyone else who wanted to listen, that when war came it would be all in. You know, he used that famous phrase in 1939 when he was writing articles for the Sydney Morning Herald. It'd be all in, and they would need Australian manufacturing to adapt rapidly to the demands of war. What he really meant, of course, was that they would need General Motors Holden. And him, as you'll see, it was him in a moment. Now, excuse me. It's important to realise that what General Motors Holden under Hartnett was doing was making lots of different kinds of motor bodies. So it wasn't just making them for their own production, it was making them for companies like Chrysler, Nash, Dodge, Austin, and so on. And their growth came from them being willing to make virtually any motor body to stick on a common chassis that the government or other clients required. And I mention this because I think this is the essence of one of the keys to their success during wartime, as we'll see. So they've developed a capacity in the 1930s under Hartnett, and he restructured the whole operations, to respond to multiple demands and deliver under great pressure against tight deadlines. And of course, General Motors itself, back in the United States, would change the design each year. So the company developed this capacity to be constantly changing and innovating in its production of bodies. They had, as I've mentioned, the benefit of a very tight tariff regime, and commonly the company would be accused of making exorbitant profits at the expense of the Australian public. But nonetheless, Hartnett, as I've said, headed off those kinds of criticisms by not only cultivating politicians, but he said that if without the tariff regime, the company would collapse, and this would have profound damage to the South Australian economy. And he said in the mid-1930s to politicians that if the company collapsed, South Australia might be prepared to secede from the Federation. Now, that seems a bit exaggerated, but some of you may know that in the 1930s, Western Australia did vote to leave the Federation, went off with their... One of my favourite bits of the 1930s history, went off with their little Charter of Independence, all wrapped up in a Jarrah cylinder, went off to Britain to sell, and their own flag with a swan in the middle, the Black Swan. Went off to London to ask the Houses of Parliament to let them secede from the Australian Federation. And they said, oh, well, you can't do that unless the Australian government, the Commonwealth government agrees, which... It didn't, so it was all over. But still, the possibility of secession was waived to explain the importance of GMH to not only South Australia, but the world. Now, when war comes, as I'm sure you know, the first 9 months of the war were this so-called phony war. I mean, after Poland had been very rapidly defeated, nothing much happens between Britain and France and Germany until the catastrophic campaigns of, catastrophic from the Allied point of view, of May, June 1940, when, of course, Paris falls and Britain is facing invasion. In that period in the phony war, the Australian government of Robert Menzies did try and pour more money and investment into the munitions factories. Now, these places like Maribyrnong, and I think there was one out at Hendon. Yes, and they had existed for some time, and they produced small arms and explosives and those kinds of commodities. And it was assumed by the Australian government that if war were to come, that would be their predominant source of production. So when Australia did start to rearm from about 1937 on, but there were all sorts of problems with rearmament that I can speak about later. And so they, as I say, did not do much but invest in those munitions factories. And the problem was that if you were not at war, then, of course, the defence forces were very reluctant to bring those factories up to full capacity because then they just have a surplus of munitions. Now, all of this changed in 1940. And as it was clear that Britain was in deep trouble, the Menzies government created something called the Directorate of Munitions and appointed Essington Lewis, the steel magnate, who has commonly been called the industrial dictator of Australia during World War II. He was given access to cabinet and to all the key committees and extraordinary power, particularly over Treasury, which of course constantly wanted to cut expenditure, as it tends to do. And this is the point at which the government decides that the only way to respond to the demands of war is to mobilise the capacity of private industry, not just their own munitions factories. And so Essington Lewis, who had worked with Hartnett in creating the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation in 1936, brings in Hartnett to be the manager or director of one of the most important parts of the Directorate of Munitions, the Director of Ordnance. So this lists what Hartnett's functions were. He had to coordinate the production of a huge range of munitions, and I say coordinate, and that being, of course, the key question. So anything, like the OM machine gun, anti-tank guns, armoured fighting vehicles, radio and signal supplies, optical munitions, small arms, locomotives, field kitchens, etc., were in his I suppose you might call it mini-empire within the Directorate of Munitions. Now, interestingly, at the same time, he remained Chief Executive of GMH. So some of the more radical critics in Parliament will say, you know, there must be a bit of a conflict of interest there. But that was sort of managed by the fact that the government would set up boards of management in each state to oversee war production. But then, most importantly, what Hartnett did was to accept that no company in Australia at wartime had the capacity to produce on its own a complex, sophisticated piece of weaponry. And so they set up a system whereby one of the major private companies would be given the role of coordinating the production of a particular weapon. And that was the role which GMH increasingly played. And arguably that was almost more important than what they produced in their own factories. And it harks back to the point I've made, which was that GMH had already learnt to do this in the production of motor bodies, you know, work with a range of smaller companies. As I've said, nobody was really in the position where they could produce complex guns, high-tech shells, and so on. So they appointed one coordinating agency, and GMH was already in the position to do that because it had worked with multiple outside firms, funneled their products into their own assembly lines, and so on. So this is a picture which I found in the State Library, as you can see, taken artfully with my own iPhone. This is from a wartime piece of propaganda that GMH produced. And when you can see what they're proud of is that their gun production is not just done in their own factories. They have coordinated all of these subcontractors from around Australia. And what they talked about was they often would get a prototype, say, of a British weapon, or perhaps the plans, and then they'd disassemble the weapon and then invite the subcontractors to come in and say, well, you know, what can you make of this gun? And then it was GMH's responsibility to bring it all together as something that worked. And of course to ensure that it came in on time, because all of this is happening or being put in place in 1940 and 41, and then comes the huge crisis at the end of 1941 when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and it looks for a few dreadful months as if Australia might be invaded. In fact, we know in retrospect the Japanese decided not to invade Australia, but I'm always quite entertained, I have to say, by the thought that trenches for people to shelter in from air attack were built in the Otway Mountains in the south of Victoria. So that shows how scared people were. So there's a sense of huge urgency which is driving production, and GMH has this role, as I said, of coordinating the production. 3,000 guns in less than 3 years. But while doing this, GMH also really stopped producing civilian cars in any significant amount. It did continue to produce trucks and other cars, but those for military use during the war. And then it turned about 80 to 90% of its capacity into war production. Lovely photograph of the guns, of which they were very proud. And I've just listed there some of the items that GMH produced. Extraordinary range, really, from, as I say, their more traditional vehicles through to aircraft engines, pontoons, tents. They were particularly skilled at developing high technologically sophisticated lenses for, directing weapons and so on. But they, as I said, were particularly pleased with their production of guns and aircraft engines. They're there's details below about the building of the Beaufort bombers, for example, a British plane that they tried to reproduce in Australia, but I'll return to that in a moment. GMH produced the fuel tanks for the bombers as well as other materials. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the extraordinary nature of the achievement. I mean, particularly because they had a very different workforce in the 1930s to that which they needed in the 1940s. And one of the issues which my colleagues have been working on, and on which is some good material below in the exhibition, is the changing character of the workforce during the war years. Now, keeping a good workforce was a major problem because the more patriotic of the men decided that they would go off and fight. And in the early years of the war, GMH was drained of its personnel. And its skilled workers, were going off to enlist in the Second Australian Imperial Force. Now, with the war crisis from 1940 on, many of the occupations that were key to GMH's operation, like engineering and the more technical aspects of engines and machine tools development, they were all declared reserved occupations. So you were not allowed to volunteer if you were in a reserved occupation. Indeed, as the crisis intensified, nor were you allowed to leave the company that you were recruited into. So GMH becomes, of course, a protected industry, but they still had to train the workforce to do these far more sophisticated tasks. And indeed, of course, as we all know, they started to recruit women. Now, the role of women, I'm sure, is of interest to everybody, but it's quite a mixed story. On the one hand, the women that GMH recruited, and they claim that by 1942 in the South Australian plant, close to 20% of their employees were women. And in the displays below, it says that the workforce trying to develop the Beaufort bomber was well over a third women. And I suspect that's what they're doing on the left. They're on aircraft wing, busy doing drilling or something. So these, of course, were totally new jobs for women in the 1940s. But also, I think the women may have also been kept in what you might call kind of associated tasks to those in which women had classically worked, like the textile industry. So here they are making tents on the right. So, as we'll see in a moment, women were given new roles, but to some extent, not to the same degree as their male colleagues. The men, I think, were probably given a mixture of training both in government programs and on-site. Thus far, I haven't been able to find as much material as I would like to have about how the workforce was re-skilled. But certainly you had to develop men who could do, say, the very, very sophisticated, what's it called, inside a gun? Rifling, yeah, so that the gun actually fired in the direction it was intended to fire, and that was one of the skills they had to learn. Now, alas, we got interested in oral history a bit late, and many of the people who worked in GMH were not available to tell us what it was like to work in these factories. I sense that there was a great sense of excitement and perhaps professional satisfaction in the early period of the war, when, of course, as I've said, many people thought the Japanese were at the gates, and something like an existential threat to Australia's national security existed. But then people started to get a bit fed up, it seems, partly because of the restrictions on their mobility in the workforce, But also we know that the people working in reserved occupations were often taken to task by other members of the public because they hadn't volunteered. There's actually now, interestingly, a movement to try and give people who worked in Australian industry and in British industry medals, because they often didn't have a choice, but their work and their contribution was not given the same status as the men who volunteered. So in 1942 and 43, GMH, which prided itself on the fact that it had never had lost any working days to industrial action, had a series of strikes. One of those strikes was by women who were supposed to be paid the full rate or 90% of the rate of men, but weren't being. And they said, well, we're doing the tasks that men used to do. We want the full pay. They didn't actually get as far as they would have liked to in that claim. And another of the disputes was about the introduction, although GMH claimed they'd used it before, of time studies, basically people being clocked on and clocked off, and then their productivity measured against the amount of time that they'd been working. Now, the latter years of World War II saw a huge amount of industrial action across Australia, so much so that one of our more conservative colleagues has argued that the trade unions sabotaged the Australian war economy. But there was considerable industrial action by both the male and female workers of GMH. And I think it's because the war is getting more and more remote. You know, by 1944, it's pretty clearly over, and the Australian Imperial Force is not actively deployed in any significant battles in the latter part of the war. Now, the question I'm most interested in, and I find most difficult to ask, is what difference did it all make? Now, as I said, GMH prided itself on its role in aircraft production, but Australia didn't actually do particularly well in aircraft production. There were great success stories in munitions production, such as the Owen submachine gun, but as you'll see, we produced 700 of these Beauforts that GMH was involved in, but by the time they were produced, alas, they were becoming a bit obsolete on the battlefield. A lot of our effort went into producing the Wirraways and Wackets, and while they did a great job at training pilots, they were shot out of the air by Japanese Zero. And of course, the majority of Australian airmen went to serve in Britain via something called the Empire Air Training Scheme. So the training was very important, but they got a lot of their training in Canada and what was then Rhodesia. And later in the war, Australia tried to produce Mustangs and Lancaster bombers and Mosquitoes, but as you can see, we had very little success in producing them. And so towards the latter years of the war, the RAAF is being supplied with American aircraft rather than locally produced aircraft. And while I don't want to strike too negative a note, because I do think the transformation of the Australian economy during World War II was quite remarkable, aircraft matter. These are one of the most important weapons of modern warfare, and we had to rely on Americans. We couldn't buy them from the British because they needed every aircraft they could get themselves. And one of the untold stories about World War II is that probably you could argue that our most important contribution as a country was what we gave the Americans. Now, but under Lend-Lease, the Americans, of course, gave all of the Allies an extraordinary amount of material, on which they then had to pay for, or the Russians didn't pay for it, but the British did. But in Australia, what happened was that we shifted. The focus of Australia's economy shifted from about mid-1943 on to supplying the Americans. And we provided them with masses of stuff. I've listed some of the items up there. Here's just, one half a day's supply for one very small part of the American army of bread. Something like 1 million GIs transited through Australia during World War II. Didn't often come to South Australia. They largely went through Queensland, but that General Douglas MacArthur did come through Tarawi. But this arguably, and I'd say arguably, was our biggest contribution to World War II. And it's never talked about because it's not as exciting or seemingly dramatic as battles. And as I say on the screen, we're one of, I think, probably the only country that gave to the United States more than we received from the United States. And it was things like food and uniforms and landing craft. I mean, boats were built down at Birkenhead. Barracks, keeping airfields operating. And it's a story which I think we do need to know more about. So in summary, I think you can attribute to GMH considerable, extraordinary success. I mean, it did prove remarkably innovative and adaptive in wartime for a combination of reasons. It was positioned as the largest automotive industry before the war, so it had a very good base from which to work. But it was supported, as I say there, by the wider mobilisation of the Australian economy and, of course, money from the government. And one of the great posters to raise money from the Australian public during World War II said, "War costs big money." And we very rarely talk about it. But you have to fund all this, and the Australian government naturally was willing to do so far as it could in the 1940s. Prior to that, it was constrained by very conservative economic or financial orthodoxy, which said you had to balance every budget. You couldn't have deficit budgeting. World War II got rid of that. It had transnational support from the United States. It had a pre-war track record, as I said, of being able to manage very complex assembly and production operations. But as I say, it's hard in some ways to say how much of the production of some weapons was GMH, how much was this cooperative exercise that GMH very effectively supervised. And the other question that fascinates me, as I suppose in the story of World War I, is how do we compare? Indeed, should we compare? But how do we compare the performance of the Australian economy with that of other economies? We were a very small economy in World War II, and prior to World War II, we were largely reliant on the export of particularly wool and wheat. And the manufacturing sector was really only growing. So you can't have extraordinary expectations, I think, of the Australian economy in World War II. But let's just look at this one. On the left, you have what Woodville produced. On the right, you have what General Motors in America produced. Now, it may be a very invidious comparison because of the size of the economies, but look at the bombers. How many aircraft did I have Australia producing? 2,300? That's a conservative estimate. By some estimates, and I'll go on to another slide in a moment, the United States produced somewhere between 200 and 300,000 aircraft in World War II and gave to its allies, either as a loan or a sale, 140,000 aircraft. This is what MAGA is all about in America. This is the great and glorious time. And, you know, Trump is now suggesting that we rename VE Day, Victory Day, and he's saying America won the war. Well, it didn't. It certainly won the Pacific War, but didn't win the European War. The Red Army did. But Joseph Stalin, in one of his more grumpy moments during World War II, said, three things are needed to win this war: blood, money, and time. He said the Russians will provide the blood, the Americans will provide the money, and the British provide the time. You can imagine Winston Churchill was very riled by that assessment. But I used to think that would be a good exam question to set. Does this explain why the Allies won in Europe? The Pacific War is a totally different question. The Pacific War is an American war and they win, hands down. So that's just to give you some idea of the scale of our production. And this I find extraordinary. This is the number of combat aircraft produced in World War II. And America produced more combat aircraft in 1944 than Japan did in the whole of the war. We don't get a mention on this chart, I'm afraid. But it does. You remember the US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, and its production was almost unimaginable in scale. I've already talked a little about that. I think also we have to give credit to Hartnett. Now that leads me on to the story that I'm sure you're all interested in, is how did this all go into Australia's car? Well, I think there's a good argument that GMH's performance during wartime positioned it to be the leader to have the role of producing Australia's own car. There had been discussions about that before World War II, but it, of course, had been interrupted by the war. But the Secretary of the Department of Munitions, a man called John Jensen, worked very closely with Hartnett, and he told the government of John Curtin that if you're going to have a car, GMH was the company for the job, the firm for the job. And so it's very interesting, when they decided to call for tenders to make the all-Australian car in 1944, the processes were not rigged, but adapted to allow GMH to win. In effect, the government had accepted the GMH tender before Ford even got its bid in. And GMH offered the government a good deal in terms of the risk and financial contribution that the federal government was going to make. So here he is. Now, I'm told we're meant to call that the Holden 1948. Not an FX, but it was an FX. 48,215. Yes, and that's Ben Chifley, presumably saying she's a beauty. Is that what he said when he saw the first Holden? So I guess a question that I still keep in my mind is, what was cumulatively the extent of change wrought in the Australian economy and GMH by World War II? And I think it was probably very extensive, but it would vary according to particular areas what you look at. Nonetheless, we all know that General Motors Holden got the contract to make Australia's own car, and here it is. I love that picture, isn't that beautiful? There she is, out there. Is she on a horse? No, she's sitting next to a few sheep. I don't need to tell my brother-in-law here that 1950s, of course, was the absolute apogee of wool prices, I think, in the 20th century, wasn't it? The 1950s. We still rode on the sheep's back in the 1950s. So where else to put your FJ than out in the paddock? But Hartnett, I quote there, he said, "The war has shown that Australians can compete successfully with other countries, and that we can make any articles we require." And there is, I think, as I've indicated, much of what Hartnett said was a bit of an overstatement, but there is an obvious kernel of truth within that. Now, I thought I couldn't finish with this audience, and I have in the front row my two sisters and their husbands, with our first Holden. And I imagine most of you in this audience have had a Holden. Now, this is not quite ours. I think we had the model before that didn't have quite such sharp headlights, but we did have the two-tone green. I remember how I loved the two-tone green, and looking downstairs I see that the two-tone Holden didn't last very long. It was only a few years that we had two-tone, but my goodness, we were proud of our Holden and thought it much better than the second-hand Austin that we got rid of. I'll end there and leave you time for some questions. Questions, comments?